Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monique Biancu, and I am from Amazon Web Services Institute. You can think of us as a think tank which helps public service accelerate their mission. I'm sure you're having a fabulous day today with all the amazing keynotes and sessions. I will be your moderator for this partner session on building a more agile government through cloud computing. And together we'll explore how cloud computing can help accelerate an organization's mission. We'll be looking at lessons learned from different government organizations about their cloud journeys and share how public cloud is a key driver for economic opportunities, how it can help promote a more secure, effective, and innovative government, as well as explore policy frameworks for cloud and present a template for best practices for a digital economy. We will have plenty of time for questions and answers after the presentations, so we will have a Q&A session at the end. But I do ask during the presentations, if you have questions, please feel free to just send it through, and we hope to get through all, if not most of the questions. So we have three really exciting speakers lined up for this session. The first is Lynn Mayan, who is Executive Director of the Cloud Computing Association, and she will be helping to frame up our discussion on cloud, helping us with its definitions, its benefits, the advantages it provides to governments. Next, we'll have Gregor Hoppe, who is a enterprise strategist at AWS, and he'll be sharing more specifics on government digital transformation. And then rounding out our discussion here will be Quint Simon, who's head of public policy here at APAC for AWS, and she'll be sharing best practices and policy frameworks for a digital economy. So before I hand it off to Mayan, I wanted to share that Mayan is currently the research director at TRPC and the chair of ACCA's Public Policy Regulatory Working Group. She's got an impressive decade of experience in development, tech policy, and communication across Asia Pacific, working with organizations on thought leadership, on government relations, and stakeholder outreach efforts. Her career has spanned a number of regional and global institutions, such as the World Bank and the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, as well as the Singapore Internet Projects. She is also an active member of trade associations and civil society groups, as well as lectures on internet and ICT policy at the National University of Singapore. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Mayan.
Hi, everybody. Can you guys hear me? Just double checking, because suddenly with two screens, you suddenly need to become an octopus, as many people have found out in this time of COVID, right? I am going to be speaking a little bit to you about building a more agile government through cloud computing. And I apologize if I'm not looking directly at you, because you guys are all on this screen, but my presentation is on the other screen. And this would be a lot easier if we were in person, but we can't be, and I'm really sorry about it. Very happy to be discussing this with you guys. If you have questions, I think that there is a way for you guys to ask questions on the chat function. So please do feel free to do that, and we will get to it. As Monique has very kindly introduced me, I am the Managing Director of TRPC, which is a research consulting company, and also the Executive Director for the Asia Cloud Computing Association. I will be presenting to you from a sort of behind the scenes. I won't do a presentation mode for these the slides that I will share, because I do need to zoom in on this particular second slide, which you will see is an emerging cloud-based technology roadmap, and it is a terrible, terrible diagram, because you actually need to zoom in to actually figure out what exactly is going on. Well, the idea behind cloud is that it's supposed to be enabling governments to do a lot of things. But the trouble is that we don't really know what exactly it is that cloud can actually do for you. And this diagram is here because, and it's from Gartner and CEB, and these slides will be shared with you after this particular session. I really like this particular slide because, this diagram, because it sort of portions out the idea of cloud into hosting technologies, storage technologies, employee computing and mobility, security, networking. So it actually gives you a holistic picture of where each of these segments are. And if you zoom in on each of these, you can see actually, for example, for hosting technologies, you have cloud orchestration software as an in-deployment section. And for the in-pilot session, you've got public cloud-based as a platform, cloud operating systems, public public cloud-based disaster recovery, etc., etc. So if you're actually very much more into the technology discussion and you're thinking, I'm here because I really want to learn what it means for us to be talking about digital transformation and building a more agile government through cloud computing, I think that this particular map will help you locate yourself within the ecosystem, which might help you be able to have a few more conversations and go a little bit faster into identifying the areas which you'll need assistance with. So when it comes time for us to be talking about building an agile government, what does it really mean? How can we build this agile government? Cloud computing, many people have talked about it. We know that it's basically computing on a really big scale where we can use shared resources, where we can look at a database which can be shared across many people, for example. So there are a lot of areas in which this is just both the shareability and the scalability of cloud is what we can be using it for. There are more technical discussions and more technical definitions which you can look for on the web, so I won't really cover it. I really want to get down in this particular session to the realities of what you, as a government official, as somebody who is in the public service, can be using the cloud for. For the Asia Cloud Computing Association, how we have been talking to governments about cloud computing and about how we can be assisting governments think about how to accelerate your cloud readiness within your country is that we have the Cloud Readiness Index, which is a publicly available free resource that you can download. The link is, I think, somewhere in the next slide, or you can just do a quick web search for it. We look at cloud computing through 10 parameters that each government can look into and improve. Broadband, international connectivity, which is how well your country interconnects with the rest of the world. Broadband quality within your country, power grid, green policy, and sustainability for making sure that your data centers stay safe, data center risk, cybersecurity, privacy, government regulatory environment, IP protection, business sophistication, and freedom of information. So those are the 10 parameters that we have provided within the Cloud Readiness Index. And we are, again, happy to be providing this for you free of charge. I have slides at the end of my presentation. So if you have, if you do get sent this document following this presentation, you can actually have a read of it for those of you who are more interested. I do have a non-readable slide that is here that gives you a quick, short rundown of each of these parameters. But this is essentially the way that we're thinking how governments can become more agile. In order to become more agile, these are the basic building blocks that we think that you will need when it comes to being cloud ready. I want to share with you right now a little bit more of a new research that we have from TRPC, which is government and the public service. There are institutional pillars. There are people who are looking at digitization. We want to talk about each of the government pillars and what exactly is the digitization needs of public service. And you can correct me and you can chat with us following this this discussion if you want. What does the public service need? How does it need to digitize? How can cloud help? So this is a sort of general pillars of government that are common throughout the entire world, or where the ministries or the departments are situated, just as a silo, and the public service digitization needs that we've sort of mapped out in the first instance. So for example, if you're coming from the Ministry of Communications and Information, you'd probably need the ability right now to communicate with the public quickly, really efficiently. You might actually now need to have in-house crews that actually produce very short snippets and videos, etc. So, I mean, this is just one example. This is not the universe of what the Ministry of Communications and Information does, for example. But one example is that now you need to be considering things like, oh, we need a facility right now that has video rendering requirements and that ability to actually render really quickly. We need to host a whole bunch of videos because we don't want to host it on the public cloud platform. We actually want to host it in-house on GovCloud, for example. How do we do this? Can we do this? Or can we find a hybrid solution? That's one of the questions that Ministry of Communication and Information could have. Looking at another ministry, perhaps you can look at the Ministry of Defense. You have cyber threat monitoring and responses that you need. You may actually need to have the capacity to have a cyber offensive posture, and that's something which also you need to have the ability to scale up for and not. So the Ministry of Health, for example, we've got COVID-19 track and tracing, hospital capacity, staff deployments. There are all of these issues that will be needed to be dealt with within the government and public service. So question is, what what exactly is the need right now? You see that I've tried to draw really badly, unfortunately, because I can't, I couldn't quite make the arrows work for me. But you can see that something like the Ministry of Finance with its tax collection, subsidies and recording, you'd probably want to link it with the databases or some sort of system from the Ministry of Social or the Ministry of Welfare for welfare disbursements and social subsidies, for example. They would need to interconnect. The same for Ministry of Education, right? We talk about the digital divide, especially when this COVID-19 time. We'll need to find a way to make sure that the people and the students who don't have sufficient resources to fund their education do get some sort of social welfare support from the government, and that needs to be interconnected, and those databases actually do need to connect. So what exactly are the challenges right now that we're seeing to digital government that are impeding us from building a agile government that I think that cloud can help? The first is, and I've distilled it down to 5 solutions or 5 challenges. The first is there are existing digital silos. Now, this is not the fault of the public service. We like to blame government for everything, but I want to say very clearly that it's not the fault of the public service that there are existing digital silos. Like it or not, it's a hierarchy, right? You have the Ministry of Defense, you have the Ministry of Health, you have the Ministry of Transport, they are by definition different separate ministries. The trouble is that right now we have a challenge. A lot of the government agencies have been really, really innovative, and I really want to give the public servants on this call, the kudos if you've done this. A lot of people actually try the technology first. A lot of people have actually tried to go on cloud first, and it's been really innovative and useful. But now is the time that we need to consolidate, and you really need to ask yourself: is the technology available for that large-scale whole of government consolidation to happen? And I think that with cloud, the answer is yes, it's available right now. How you do it is a different matter, but we'll pause there first. But the tech definitely in cloud computing is available. The second challenge is midstream consolidation, which is always going to be the case for technology, by the way. So I don't want you to think that this is a new thing for cloud. Midstream consolidation is always, you're in the middle of doing whatever it is that your ministry is doing, and then suddenly the government comes down with an instruction that says, we need a whole of government solution. Oh no, I can't stop because we're moving ahead. For example, think about COVID-19, right? You can't stop COVID-19 testing just because you want to move to a new system. You don't want to do that. But we need to consolidate different systems. We need to have strong leadership to make some really unpopular decisions. So for example, do you need to pull the plug on a legacy system because it's just really too old? It cannot tolerate the needs of the 21st century. We'll need strong technical advice to explain what is technologically feasible with cloud, and we'll link it back to a really strong return on your investment, because you don't just want to move to the cloud for no reason, just because it's a new thing. You don't want to do that. You want to do that for really, really good reasons, not just for efficiency reasons, for cost saving reasons, but because you want to be able to deliver better public service. And I think that is core to a lot of what people are talking about in this session today. The core is actually better public service. How can we better serve the citizens? How can we better serve our constituents with good services? And how can we digitize and transform our government much more efficiently so that people can benefit from better governance? So that's the second. The third is very linked to the second. We need to build for scaling and for future proofing. The question is, how do you make decisions based on an unknown future? You don't know how your government is actually going to build later on, right? Good news for you, cloud computing actually can scale for you. We can actually modularize a lot of things, and you need really trusted advice from partners in order to do this. So the technology, I can reassure you, is there. And the nice thing about cloud technology is it's both scalable, but it's also it also evolves along with the technology itself. So the way that it's designed is actually fairly modular in the way that we're doing things. So you need trusted advice from partners to give you good advice on how to link it back to what is technologically feasible and what is a strong ROI as well. The fourth and really, really important thing is, of course, cybersecurity. You need to protect against threats. I've divided this into 3 sections. You need to protect against existing threats. You need to secure against user behavior. And I always give the example of my mother on this. She's one of those people who sticks her password with a Post-it note on the screen. And I'm always thinking, Mom, you really don't want to be doing that. But how can you as the government secure against user behavior? Obviously, we're talking about 2-factor authentication, X-factor authentication here, or tokenization. That's definitely definitely available on the cloud. And the third is tracing back cybercrime and cyber incidents. For your digital forensics, is there a capacity to do that? So your cybersecurity breaks down into three things. And I, again, want to tell you that for cloud computing, I think that it does give constant updatability, if that's actually a word, constant updatability, and you can keep up to date on these things with regard to cybersecurity and cyber threats that our governments are dealing with all the time. The fifth and the last challenge before I end this particular section of my presentation is the challenge of the absolute need for interconnection between government silos right now. We need that interconnection to happen, yet we need to balance it with the need for a way to contain in case there's any cyber threat that comes along that infects and starts to worm its way around the system. We need a way to also yet balance that with certain containment. And cloud, I'm happy to say, actually has this thing called containers, which actually allow you to sandbox certain environments as well. So there are lots of ways in which cloud can really help with an agile government development with cloud computing. Very happy to be chatting with you about this. I'm going to turn back the time to Monique to bring us forward. And thank you very much all for listening.
Hi, thank you so much, Mayanne. Thanks so much for helping us understand a little bit more about the challenges as well as the needs for cloud, particularly in these unprecedented times. I would like to now introduce Gregor Hoppe, who's an enterprise strategist at Amazon Web Services based here in Singapore. He helps advise technology leaders in the transformation of both their technology platform and their organization, assuring them that the corporate strategy connects with the technical realities and vice versa. He's got 2 impressive decades of experience in digital native companies, enterprise IT, professional services. He brings extensive experience in IT strategies, enterprise architecture, digital transformation, and of course, cloud computing. He's also published several books on the role of architects, cloud strategy, as well as authoritative texts on distributed messaging architectures. His articles have been featured in numerous publications, including Best Software Writing, 97 Things Every Software Architecture Should Know. He was also a Smart Nation Fellow to the Singapore government, as well as Technical Director in Google Cloud's Office of the CTO, as well as Chief Architect at Allianz SE. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over now to Gregor.
Yes, thanks, Monique, and thanks for having me, and thanks for the elaborate introduction. What I would like to do today is, Mayanne, I think, gave us a nice view of, highlighting again the potential of cloud computing, but also I think it became clear that there's quite a few moving parts to really translate the technology into the agility. So what I want to do is zoom out a tiny bit, look at really what we're after when we use the term agile, and then see why cloud computing is actually so essential to achieving the agility, and then of course how the different pieces meet. As Monique mentioned, right, I'm an enterprise strategist with Amazon Web Services, and that means I have spent significant time on the customer side leading major cloud transformations and cloud journeys. And in my case, that was the Singapore government, working closely with GovTech as a Smart Nation Fellow. And it was also with Allianz, major multinational financial services organization, where I was the chief architect. I like to collect my thoughts into books. I always say that forces me to straighten out my thinking, because if you feel like there's a lot of things going on and a lot of balls in the air, you're certainly not the only one. We all feel the same pressure. So writing it down in a book gives me the satisfaction to say, like, okay, at least I've made sense out of it for myself, and hopefully I can also share the ideas I have with a wider audience. So but let's talk about Agile a little bit. And before we go there, I think there's sort of one key statement I like to make after having worked for the public sector for a while, but also, as Monique said, right, I worked in consulting and I worked in the private sector. And that is, I think, the challenge is that public sector for a long time has been told that everything they do is completely different than private sector, right? And mostly we've been told that by folks who make money off us. It's the vendors, right? I always joke, it's like, you can't just go buy a pencil, you buy the government pencil for $20 because it is such a special pencil, right, that only this vendor can provide to you. And I think as we're looking at many of these things from a government and public sector lens, it is really healthy to realize that the large part of what we do, at least in the implementation side, is not that different. And this doesn't mean to belittle regulatory constraints or that we have a very different mission that we're after, and we also have a different funding model, if you wish. But in the end, the software we deliver and the software we run and the services that we build, they're actually much more like the private sector, let's say other regulated industries like financial services, right? I spent many years in financial services. I spent a good time in public sector. So I think we've been sort of primed to think that every piece of paper we touch has to be special and different. And my experience and my opinion is that is actually not true. There are a few things that make us different in the government and the broader public sector, but there's also a lot of things that we can learn from the private sector and that equally much apply to us. So with that preamble, let's talk a little bit about Agile, right? And the challenge is always with these buzzwords that the wider adoption they get, the murkier the meaning becomes. And that's a little bit unfortunate, right? It's sort of counterproductive, if you wish, right? That once a concept really gets broad attention, which is good, right? Because we want to make progress, then everybody sort of tends to have their own interpretation and nuance, which again makes it very difficult to benefit from it. So here are a couple of views that I have on what makes the essence of agility. And the first trap to fall into is that people say, oh, I need to be agile so I can deliver things faster. And I hold against that if it was purely about speed, it would be called fast method, not agile method, right? It's called agile method because it gives you the ability to react quickly and course correct quickly. So I've been accused many times for using too many car metaphors. So here is one, right? If you think about it, agility isn't your gas pedal. There's other things that can help you speed up, and I'll speak about some of them. Agility is your steering wheel. And the reason we talk about that so much these days is, in the past, IT delivery and software delivery and many other things were more like going down a straight line. Right, and that's if you go down a straight line, speed is probably the key parameter you have. Now, if you look at the recent history, and especially 2020, well, that doesn't look like a straight line at all. That looks like an obstacle course, right? And of course, if you're driving or running across an obstacle course, you need the steering wheel. And that's why Agile is suddenly, again, so much in favor. It gives you the ability to course correct. So if somebody says, oh, we want to become agile so we deliver faster, that is only half the story or perhaps missing the main point. It is so we can react faster either to external circumstances, right? Whether it's a pandemic or travel restrictions, or whether it's geopolitical changes, or it can also be end user requirements, or it can be a problem we have with our software, right? That also makes us react very quickly. So that's point number one. Point number two to highlight around Agile is it has a little bit of sort of a notion that if we become Agile, we're kind of shooting from the hip. And as you've seen from my books, right, I'm an architect by heart, right? I wrote a whole book about the role of architects and architecture in digital transformation, because I'm convinced that architecture and therefore architects play a pivotal role in a transformation. So sometimes there's this idea that, oh, if we're agile, we don't need a lot of architecture. And again, I think this is far from the truth. Because in the end, architecture gives you the sustained velocity. If you need to do something once, and you never need to change it again, you don't need a lot of architecture. Just put it together somehow, a lot of duct tape and string wire, get it working. Right, good enough. You do need architecture when you need changes, when you have uncertainty, right? I want to move my application to the cloud. I want to scale out my application. Right? I want to maybe have a hybrid model. I need to deploy on a mobile device, right? This is all uncertainty, and this is all about architecture. So it's very important to understand that both architecture and agility thrive in times of high uncertainty, because the agility allows us to course correct more quickly. As we said, it's the steering wheel, and architecture gives us more options. So if we need to scale out our application, if we need to add more compute resources, we have that option thanks to architecture. If we build sort of a giant monolith, some sort of wired together hairball, we do not have that option. And that will ultimately limit our ability to deliver, especially in uncertain times. So this is another reminder, right? Agile is not anything that stands against planning and architecture. Both approaches thrive in times of high uncertainty. And last time I checked, we were just joking before this call a little bit about all our little isolation experiences and travel hurdles that we faced. I would say we do live in times of high uncertainty. So that's my argument that both architecture and agile are things you're going to want in your organization. And that's a perfect segue into the third element. And I come back to the discipline. Right? Here's a picture from Formula One that I actually took last year when we were still allowed to watch that. If you look at things that move quickly, you're tempted to think it's a little bit chaotic, right? The first time I saw like one of these pit stops, and yes, it's another car metaphor, sorry about that. I believe there's about 20 people. I'm not the absolute experts, right? I like the cars whizzing by. I don't do all the science behind it. I think it's about 20 people, and they put 4 new tires on this car. They make adjustments to the aerodynamics. And in the old days, they were even able to put fuel in like 3.5 seconds or something, or 3 seconds, right? There's a guy on the right, I think, who's holding a stopwatch here in the picture. Now, when you watch this at real speed, it's just like zip, 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 zip. It's like, what was that? But of course, you'll quickly understand that this is one of the most disciplined processes that we have on the planet. Right? Where else do we lift the car, take 4 wheels off, make some adjustments, talk with the driver, wipe the windshield, right? And it's all in a matter of seconds. So this is the third point I wanted to make. Speed begets discipline. If you do not have the discipline, this will be an utter disaster. Like, the car will be with 3 wheels on and falling off the lift, right? It'll be absolute mayhem. So if you want to move faster, if you want to steer more quickly, to be more agile, you need to also bring more discipline. And that is a tough message, both for private and public sector, because we often pride ourselves of having high discipline, but in reality, we don't. We sort of remote control our projects by funding approvals, status updates, right? And sort of things always to look a little bit good. I call this the watermelon status reports, right? They're green on the outside, they're red on the inside. We don't look too closely what's inside. That is not discipline. And just because we move slowly, we think that brings discipline, but it doesn't. So there's a very interesting message. I worked in Silicon Valley for over a decade, and then I worked for a large insurance company. And the message I gave them repeatedly is, you guys think the Silicon Valley people have no discipline, but actually the opposite is true. The fast-moving companies have extremely high discipline, and you probably suffer from a little bit low discipline. You just don't see it because you're moving relatively slowly. So 3 very important messages here around the agility, right? It's the steering wheel. Right? Architecture is not the opposite of agility. They both go hand in hand. And then discipline is one of the most important ingredients to making this work. Now, with that preamble, we can look a little bit like, all right, sounds good in the abstract. How do I get there? Right? And when we have this conversation with our customers, right, like my team, we have between 150 and 200 customer conversations a year. The first hurdle we need to take is that the common view is that the world of optimization and efficiency is rather the opposite of experimentation and agility. right? It would seem very different whether we're fine-tuning something or whether we're running an experiment. And the first conversation we need to have is these things are actually much more similar than you would think. And again, it comes down to the steering wheel and the gas pedal. In certain times, it's about optimization. You know exactly what you're going to do, and you're going to do it slightly better. And to be honest, that's what IT has been doing for decades, both in the government and the private sector. We took things that we would be doing anyway, right? All the business processes or government processes, whether it ranges from a passport renewal to registering a birth certificate to dispersing payments, right? All the things we would be doing anyway with our citizens, we just automated. So it was easy to optimize. We kind of knew what we were after. Now, in uncertain times when we're not so sure what we're after, we need experimentation and agility, but the two are not as different as it may seem. And I explain why I think this way. So how does improvement work? Well, improvement works relatively simple if you think about it. You need transparency. You need to know how you're doing. Then based on this transparency, the data, you need a plan to improve, right? How you can do better. And then you deliver, right? You implement the improvement. And you do this continuously, right? And that's how IT justifies itself largely, because we're able to operate more efficiently, more accurately, more reliably. And we do this because we continuously improve the way we work. Now, how do you run experiments? Well, you deliver something, you gain the transparency how it comes out, and then you make a data-driven decision. Was the experiment successful or was it not successful? Now you do this also in iterations, because an experiment that never fails wouldn't be one. So yeah, you might try another experiment, you might refine. Now, the interesting thing is if you do this continuously, they look fairly similar. And that is my key message. The difference is the pace. Right? And that comes a little bit back to the gas pedal. This is about taking friction out of your system so that this cycle can complete much more quickly. And I give you a hint, right? This is where cloud computing plays a critical role, right? You don't wait 2 months for the server. The developer doesn't wait like 3 weeks for the laptop to be delivered, right? You don't wait weeks and weeks and weeks to have a user test what you build. You do automated tests and deploys, right? All these fancy things that cloud computing give us, they take the friction out of the system so that this wheel can spin more quickly. And translate this even more closely into reality. Of course, as a cloud provider, we also bring all three elements to you, right? It's not like we give you better servers, right? Happy to do that, but that's just the beginning of the story, by no means the end. Right? We also have the broader set of analytics and machine learning tools, right? That is all to give you the transparency so you know how you're doing. And then, of course, we also help you transform your culture. One of the most popular workshops we have at AWS is called the Culture of Innovation, because this is exactly the same cycle in which we work. We also live in a world of high uncertainty. Until 2020, Amazon did not have a concept of prioritized delivery of essential goods. We also never hired 100,000 people in a quarter, right? So a lot of things that were new for us. So this cycle works for us, and we bring all three elements, of course, to our customers. Because in the end, the cycle is a value chain. And the key property of a value chain is that if one piece is missing, right, it's a chain. If one link is broken, the chain doesn't work. So you do need all three elements, and we bring all three elements to you. The good news is once this value chain, this cycle runs, it is continuous improvement and a continuous betterment. And that's the amazing thing. You don't need to make a giant leap. You will make smaller steps and improve continuously because you have the transparency. And you can do that because you have lower friction in the system. And that's a question we often get. It's like, well, wouldn't it be more efficient if we sort of did it right the first time? And yes, in a world of absolute certainty, if you could be a perfect guesser, yes, it might be more efficient to do it right the first time. In a world of uncertainty and feedback and continuous change and improvement, the ability to steer, the ability to run in these cycles is much more efficient. Because otherwise you might be just running the wrong direction faster, and that's not what's called efficiency, right? That's, I don't know what the word for that is, definitely not a good word. So in this world of uncertainty, the ability to iterate and course correct is actually the new efficiency. Now, I have one last car metaphor here, and that is, well, we have all learned that when things move more quickly, consumption goes up. Right? That's why I said people feel like, oh, if I need to make more iterations, isn't this less efficient? Am I spending more? And 2020 is not the year where anybody's looking to spend more, right? We want to innovate, but we want to innovate without breaking the bank. Now, here we have luck that software is not like an engine, right? If we do things right and the cloud computing platform helps us do that, we can move faster without actually increasing fuel consumption. And I give you two key mechanisms, how that works. The first one is because we used to have a lot of friction in the system. We always made big projects and big deliverables and big timelines, right? And this was the same in the financial sector. I was once asked by the top executives, I said, if you gave us one advice, what would it be? And little bit tricky question, but I said, I think the main mistake we make, we always have a large project, and if it doesn't deliver exactly the results we wanted, we make an even larger one. And there was a lot of nodding in the room. So the key mechanism here is to stop doing these large projects, these large teams, and these large timelines, and break it into smaller pieces. And the smaller pieces go across all three dimensions. This means smaller teams. You guys might have heard of the famous Amazon 2 pizza teams, right? A good team size is like 5, 6, 7, 8 people, right? The folks who can comfortably eat 2 pizzas. It's shorter timelines, right? It's not 18 months, right? But it's a couple of weeks or maybe a few months. And it is also smaller deployments, right? It's not like, oh, here's the million lines of code we worked on for the last decade. It is more like a small continuous improvement. And that allows you to reduce the friction, and that gives you the ability to steer without increasing the cost. Because in case you need to fix one of the pieces, it's a much smaller piece. You made a smaller change. It's easier to undo. Now, the whole world wouldn't be as interesting if there wasn't a catch. And the catch here is that our organizations are built on optimizing locally. And that's very much true in federated organizations. So even in Singapore, right, we're a relatively compact government, but still I work with GovTech. We have a lot of agencies, we have a lot of ministries, right? So there's a lot of moving parts in the organization. And we generally manage by optimizing locally. And that makes some sense, right? Because optimizing locally, it gives you accountability, it gives you better transparency. You can fix the things that you're responsible for. Now, there's one problem with this. And the problem is that the sum of local optima is rarely or never a global optimum, right? We all know this, right? You optimize locally, it's like going to the office, take a number and wait forever for service. That is because somebody optimized their process, ignoring the end-to-end. If you call customer service and they say, I need to transfer you to somebody else because that's not my department, somebody optimized locally, and we all hate it. Right? So local optimization is a crutches, if you want to be blunt. It's not what the customer wants. And at Amazon, we know this extremely well because no customer will give us credit for 98% delivery. I always say, the thing was on the truck. Your package was almost at your house. Nobody cares, right? It is end-to-end optimization 100%. Now, the trick here is that when we make smaller pieces to not fall in the trap of optimizing even smaller pieces. So the balance to find is to make smaller pieces, and cloud technology allows us to do that, but to optimize end to end. And that is a fundamentally different way of working. That's transformation. Now, of course, smart people ask a question, and that is, if this is so clever and works so well, why didn't we do this always, right? Why haven't we worked this way all along? And that answer, in hindsight, is obvious. The simple answer is we did not have the tools. Right? You can only do this. You can have the small pieces if you have favorable software economics, like reduce friction, automation, many of the things Mayan alluded to, right? You can provision a server like this. You can provision storage like this. You can build software like that. Without this, smaller pieces will never function, right? Automation is a big part of it. Transparency, we already alluded to. If you have more parts, you need to know what's going on. And of course, you need intelligent insights, right? That's how you get the end-to-end optimization. So the lesson we learn here is that cloud allows us to work fundamentally differently, and not doing that would also mean you're not getting the benefit from the cloud. The tech is nice and it's great, right? We know that, But if you don't use it to change the way your organization works, you're not actually getting the benefit that it was meant to deliver. So with that understanding, as food for thought, right, we said we take some questions at the end. A few examples that are very close to home right here from the work I did there with Singapore and Singapore GovTech. And one argument that often comes is like, well, the government, we don't have sort of these last minute, agile, uncertain requirements, right? We're legislative, we have planning cycles, right? The things we do planning, we do many things, right? We deal with people, life events. There's a general notion that those things don't happen from today till tomorrow. Well, now here's a very nice counterexample of that, where something did happen today and tomorrow, right? And at GovTech, we built very, very quickly. We built a system, right? So we basically had a little bit less than 2 months, right, during the circuit breaker, basically, the ability to build tracing tools. And this is just one of many, right? There's Trace Together, there is tokens. This is safe entry, right, that you can use straight from your phone without any app. You scan the QR code. And in that case, in that way, in case there's an infection, we can notify other people and do contact tracing, right? And that is a key vehicle during a pandemic. Now, this is built on Amazon S3. This is built on AWS Lambda, right? The serverless kind of tools. If you had tried to attempt this in a sort of traditional setup, it would have been a 2-month cycle to just get the hardware, right? And in this case, in 2 months, the system was actually live. And it's used, I use it probably dozens of times every day, right? I think there's 700,000 access points installed, so you can quickly do the math, right? This is a easily 7-digit or maybe even 8-digit amount of traffic that it sees every day, built in a matter of weeks ultimately. And that's what cloud can do. And this is also a great example where we don't have the 2-year planning cycle, even though it's government. And last one I wanted to do, and this is again out of my very work as a Smart Nation fellow in GovTech. The key mechanism and the key thing that we achieved when I worked with GovTech, with a GovTech CEO, Ping Soon, and the permanent secretary, and many other folks, was to really get transparency in our decision making. And that comes back down to the point I made before around Agile. So to be quite honest, I said in many funding meetings, there's some high-level slides being presented, and it all sounded kind of good. And then somebody asked for money. And the money is taxpayer money, right? It's not our money, it's somebody else's money. And I'm like, well, that's quite a bit of money, right? It's a couple $1 million. It's like, shouldn't we be a lot more disciplined? And I think one of the key things that we achieved here is just like 2 simple examples. There's a link at the bottom. For giving the top executives, so the situation we had is fairly common. We are super sharp, very disciplined, highly intellectual executives and leadership in the government, but they're not technologists. Let's be honest, the technologists sometimes are not that unhappy with us, because the technologists like, well, as long as like Mayan was saying, we have all these nice buzzwords, right? It's like serverless and this and that, right? Probably management will approve. Now that is not good. So the key thing that we achieved is to use models like this, like give me clarity on how much value to deliver when. Don't tell me it's going to be $1 million and at the end I get something fantastic. Tell me what value deliver halfway, a quarter of the way, 3/4 of the way. Can I do a partial rollout? Can I shorten my time to value? If you only had half the money, how much value would you deliver, right? Could you deliver more than half the value with half the money? If you prioritize smartly, you probably could. So those are the discussions that we introduced. And that, I would say, was the big game changer for us, to give the executives the confidence to ask these kind of questions and to use a simple guideline. If something comes out of your IT which doesn't make 100% total good sense, the answer is no. Right? It's not like, it sounds kind of good. The answer is yes. It's like, no. As I said, we're not spending our money. We're spending somebody else's money. And the two are not opposing. So actually getting this discipline and transparency is actually not extra burden. It is actually, in the end, making your decision processes more efficient, because everybody knows what the assumptions are, what we're up against. So when the decision is made, off we go, and we don't have surprises and rework and things like that later. So hopefully this gives a little bit of a different angle, sort of what Agile is all about, right? Remember, it's about the steering wheel, right? Remember, it's about having the discipline. It's also about having architecture to support the agility. And then we saw that optimizing and agility is actually similar in many ways. The important things are you need the feedback cycle, you need to reduce the friction, and you need to reduce the cloud. You need to use the cloud technologies to do that. And then if you really want to transform your organization, bringing this transparency, this decision transparency and these decision models into your conversations with the IT, that is a major eye opener and ultimately allows you to work in a very different way. So hopefully that triggered some questions for later. I thank you very much for the time, and I hand back to Monique.
Great, thanks so much, Gregor. That was a really exciting presentation. Really loved your examples on the steering wheel and being agile and helping governments understand that they can use a lot of the same tools that the private sector already use to be more agile. I also want to remind participants on the line, if they have any questions, please feel free. There's some questions coming in, but feel free to ask as many questions and we'll try to get to most, if not all of them. So next up, we will have Quint, who will be sharing some of the best practices and policy frameworks. Quint is head of our public policy, APAC, for AWS. So in that capacity, she leads AWS engagements with policymakers and regulators across Asia Pacific on policy issues related to the adoption of cloud computing and emerging technologies. She's got really deep experience in cybersecurity, privacy, data protection, digital trade, and related regulatory issues. She's also the vice chair of the US ASEAN Business Council's ICT committee and sits on the executive committee of SGT Tech. Before joining AWS, she was public policy consultant, deputy head of the technology practice at APCO Worldwide, and she's led numerous public affairs and advocacy campaigns all around Beijing, ASEAN, and the Middle East. So over to you, Quint.
Thank you so much, Monique. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to address the group today on this concept of policy frameworks and best practices for a digital economy. As Monique so kindly introduced, I have the greatest job since I spend my time, talking to governments across the Asia Pacific region about how to unlock digital transformation through public policy tools. We spend so much time talking to governments about digital transformation projects. Increasingly we're seeing the public sector, especially in a post-COVID environment, moving very quickly to adopt cloud services. But the core thing that is either a blocker or an enabler of this digital transformation is the underlying policy framework. If governments don't already have a policy that enables the adoption of cloud computing tools, of all the sort of innovation and acceleration tools that my colleagues talked about, then government transformation projects just fundamentally can't proceed. So again, my sort of role in Asia Pacific is to spend time talking to governments about what are the best practices in establishing those policy frameworks so that when governments or agencies are ready to move to cloud, there's already the strategy and the thinking and the policy framework in place. I'll start my remarks today by talking a little bit about cloud deployment models. So, in the last 4 years that I've been at AWS, I've had many conversations with, government officials where I will hear the phrase, well, I already have a cloud policy because there are already data centers that serve, the public sector that serve government. I think from the AWS's perspective, when we talk about cloud, we mean something very specific. And what we're really talking about here is public cloud. And the reason for that is the benefits of cloud that some of my colleagues have already talked about are really only fully realized in a public cloud, or it's often called commercial cloud environment. And so, when governments think about establishing a cloud policy, we often spend some time sort of coaching how, fundamentally a cloud policy really needs to be focused on an adoption of a public cloud policy that really enables governments to drive the digital transformation on the public cloud. There's often these other concepts, right? Private cloud, virtual private, community, hybrid cloud, and each of those has its own role within the ecosystem. But again, in order to maximize the full benefits of cloud, what we're really talking about here is a fully public cloud. And public cloud refers to cloud infrastructure that is provisioned for open use. So it's a cloud-based application that is fully deployed in the cloud, and all parts of the application run in the cloud. Applications in the cloud have either been created in the cloud or maybe have been migrated from an existing infrastructure in order to take advantage of the benefits of public cloud. So on my next slide, I've tried to highlight here some of the core benefits of public cloud and how it's set apart from potentially some of the other cloud deployment models. So, many of our customers, and especially the public sector, are really focused on seizing the benefits around, for example, time to market. This idea that, in the past, you had to spend weeks and months provisioning a new IT resource, building a new application, and now that can be done in a matter of minutes or days, as long as you have the institutional support and the skills in order to do it. The other piece that's key to understand about the public cloud is the concept of innovation. Many people, when they think of the cloud, they still think about some of the underlying, core attributes of infrastructure as a service. So, for example, compute, storage, maybe some networking services. But really, in the last, 7 to 10 years, cloud has evolved to be so much more. Now, when we talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, Internet of Things, all of those applications inherently sit on top of the public cloud, because it's only with the sort of, infinite compute power, the infinite scalability of public cloud that those types of services can really be delivered. One of our colleagues has on the back of his phone, it's his phone protector. It basically says there's no AI without public cloud. And that, again, is a really important thing to keep in mind, because AI tools, again, really sit on top of that infinitely flexible, infinitely scalable public cloud resources. And this idea of scaling seamlessly, right? In the COVID environment, we had a few cases where customers came to us, in March and April when really the world was just first grappling with the COVID issue. And they had come to us because the Ministry of Health websites in their home countries kept crashing. And that's because they were on premise and, suddenly everyone was trying to get information on COVID and COVID testing. And so we saw very, very rapid adoption of, cloud for COVID related information because of this ability to scale infinitely. The cloud pretty much scales up and down as required. And so you don't have to guess how much IT resources you need from the outset. And that leads to, the other side of the equation, which is, reducing complexity and risk. So the really important thing to keep in mind about public cloud is that it's fundamentally a pay as you go model. And so for governments, right, it's an OpEx spend rather than a CapEx spend. And that really fundamentally helps to optimize costs. And the reason for that is, businesses no longer need to own their own data centers or plan and procure servers and other IT infrastructure weeks or months in advance. Instead of buying, owning, and maintaining their infrastructures, organizations can use cloud service provider to build their applications using these building blocks of IT resources. The public cloud also allows customers to benefit from the shared responsibility model for security, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But fundamentally, this idea that public cloud, for us, security is job zero. We will not have a business, we will not have customers unless we can assure our customers about the security of the underlying infrastructure of cloud. And we invest heavily in the economies of scale in order to deliver the sort of best-in-class security that our customers, especially our public sector customers, expect from us. And then lastly, there's this idea of reducing management complexity, because the public cloud, as Mayanne alluded to at the beginning, allows access to easy-to-use management tools for the entire technology stack. So what is a cloud-first policy? And as I mentioned, I've spent the last 3 or 4 years really talking to governments about how to develop a cloud-first policy. And internally within AWS, we've developed what we call a cloud-first playbook for Asia Pacific. And the basic idea of this document is that it brings together the best practices of how to write a really effective cloud-first policy, and puts it into a few key themes and buckets. So that's what I sort of plan to talk about today. Now, we need to start, of course, by understanding what is a cloud-first policy. And as I mentioned earlier, digital transformation is not going to be successful unless governments already have a cloud policy framework in place. And the cloud-first policy is the proven way to achieve that. So a cloud-first policy is aimed at accelerating cloud adoption within government, and it essentially directs or requires government agencies to use public cloud services as the primary enabler of IT modernization. The well-crafted cloud-first policy can really lead to those benefits we discussed earlier: cost savings, better cybersecurity outcomes, greater flexibility. And the best cloud-first policies that we've seen from governments around the world really focus on directing government agencies to, number one, include cloud as part of their strategic ICT plans and budgets, to utilize cloud for all projects and workloads, and to consider cloud while migrating or upgrading existing applications or infrastructure. Now, even in just my 4 years at AWS, I've seen the rapid adoption of cloud-first policies within Asia Pacific and around the world, to the point that many governments are moving beyond cloud-first to focus on what's being called cloud-native policies. And the real difference here is that a cloud-native policy focuses on utilizing what are called born-in-the-cloud solutions. So this idea that it's really beyond the goal of maybe thinking about using cloud when there's new when there's new needs, when there's new IT needs, to really focusing on having the entire organization, the entire public sector, be cloud native from the bottom up. And so again, the more advanced countries who have now a history of adopting cloud are moving beyond cloud first to this concept of cloud native. Now, going back to cloud-first policies, again, in our analysis of the most effective cloud-first policies around the world, we've been able to synthesize that, really the best cloud-first policies are made up of these 4 buckets. And governments will take different approaches. Some governments will put everything in a single policy document. Others will sort of break it out and have multiple policy documents. But the really, really effective cloud-first policies, in one way or another, have these 4 elements, again, to guide the government in its digital transformation efforts. And the first is really that concept of security, cloud accreditation, and compliance. So, at some level, making sure that the cloud providers that government is using are secure, accredited, and of the value and quality that government needs in order to have assurances about the security of the underlying data. Very importantly, because there's a lot of misconceptions about cloud in this space, We see, language in these policies around data privacy, data ownership, and data control. And this, borders into that data sovereignty discussion that I think is most governments are having and is, certainly important to the dialogue. Most governments will then adopt a data classification policy, which really very clearly defines, but very simply defines, here is the types of data, the data sets that we're going to move to public cloud at this point. And here are the types of data sets that, nope, we're going to decide to keep in our on-premise or private cloud environment that we're not ready yet to move to public cloud, given potentially additional security and compliance concerns. And then the very last part of a cloud first policy is really this concept of cloud contracting and procurement. So this is one that I want to make sure I emphasize at the outset, because we've seen many governments, even within Asia Pacific, where there's a wonderful cloud first policy in place that has all the key elements to be successful, except for the underlying procurement policy has not been reformed. And in those countries, we've found that governments get really excited because they're fully enabled to use cloud all of a sudden, only to find out that there's no procurement vehicle that is actually made for cloud and enables governments to make the best out of cloud services. So my one ask and call out for this group is not to forget about the underlying procurement reform or procurement updates that need to come in order to have an effective cloud first policy. So let's talk a little bit about the first concept of security, cloud accreditation, and compliance. So security is what I spend most of my time talking to governments about, and rightly so. Governments will come and say, I want to move to cloud, but I need to be able to ensure that the cloud service provider that I'm using is secure. And I need to be able to mandate a certain number of core security standards in order to make sure that the cloud partners I'm choosing to work with as a government meet a minimum bar of security. And absolutely, that is a core foundational piece of any cloud first policy. This core idea of identifying a series of standards that cloud service providers who are providing cloud services into government should meet. And those standards should give governments sufficient visibility to ensure that cloud service providers are doing what they say they are doing with respect to protecting the cloud infrastructure that is owned and operated by the cloud service provider. The good news is that in the last 2 decades of public cloud adoption, there has been an entire array of standards, certifications, attestations, and legal frameworks that have been developed in order to define the standards that cloud service providers should meet, and then to verify that they are actually meeting those standards. So I can tell you as AWS, we are audited by various standard setting bodies or by auditors every single day of the year in our global infrastructure. And that is because AWS offers a wide range of attestations and certifications that can give governments that assurance that cloud service providers, that we say we're doing what we say we're doing when it comes to cloud security. So, here's a good slide with a series of examples of the types of certifications that we commonly see in cloud first policies. From my perspective, the most common ones that I see in cloud first policies across Asia Pacific are the ISO series, so 27001, 27017, 27018. Many governments will require the security operation controls, the SOC reports, to be provided to government at their request. And then there's also a series of sort of regional or vertical focused certifications as well. So, PCI DSS as a payment standard for banks or governments that are providing financial services to the people, or for example, MTCS, which is a security standard that was developed in Singapore, and then again, AWS is audited against. So there's a series of these security and compliance controls that should be, a key part of any cloud-first policy to ensure that any provider to government is meeting a minimum bar of security quality. While we're on the topic of security, I do want to touch on this concept of the shared responsibility model, because most cloud service providers, if they're going to come and speak to you, they're going to talk about this shared responsibility model. In the past, in on-premise data centers, customers were responsible for the security of everything. They were responsible for the security of the underlying infrastructure of the cloud, the security of the cloud. And they were also responsible for protecting data that sits in the cloud. That is different under a cloud service provider model. And this is one of the benefits that many of our public sector customers really come to appreciate. And really under the shared responsibility model of cloud service providers, CSPs like AWS are essentially responsible for that security of the underlying infrastructure, so the data centers themselves. And we look after the hardware, the compute, the storage, the database, all the way up to the software level, really anything under the hypervisor for those that are more technical in the audience. Our customers, on the other hand, so our government, government sector customers are responsible for security in the cloud. So this idea of using the tools that are perhaps made available by the cloud, but ensuring the tools are used in the right way in order to protect the data that is stored in the cloud. And there's a very, very important reason for this, which is that cloud service providers do not have visibility into the data that is stored on our cloud. This is a very different business model than other technology providers. But this idea that we have no visibility, control, ability to access, certainly cannot sell or misuse data that is put on the cloud is a fundamental, core attribute of the public cloud. And so only our customers know what data they're putting on the public cloud. It's only them who knows if they're putting on, a picture of their cat, or if they're putting on, national security sensitive level data that needs the highest levels of privacy, encryption, access management tools. So we find that many governments will actually include the shared responsibility model in their cloud policy in order to ensure that government agencies that are going to choose to use cloud know the basic division of responsibility, division of labor between the cloud service provider and the customer itself. Now, speaking of data, this is often a conversation that I have with governments as well. And, we find that most governments want to be very explicit in their cloud first policies about some of the core principles around data ownership, data control, and data security. Now, I've already mentioned that, it's AWS's customers, it's the government who owns and controls the data that's put on the public cloud. They decide what data they're putting in, they decide where geographically it's stored, they decide how it will be used, they decide what security and encryption and privacy controls are put in place. And many governments will actually put in their cloud first policy language that specifies that classifies and defines the data handling roles and responsibilities for each party, that allows the use of out-of-country data processing facilities as long as the data is processed and stored in a modern, highly secure public cloud environment. Most governments will state very clearly that data that is put on the public cloud is owned by the data, and there's no transfer of ownership of the data. And then increasingly, we're finding that most policies will make reference to various cross-border data transfer models, such as in Asia Pacific, the APAC cross-border privacy framework. So again, that all features very prominently in the cloud first policies that we see across the region. Now, let's talk a little bit about classification. So, most governments already have classification systems for public sector data. And so classifications for the public cloud is pretty straightforward exercise. governments will typically take the internal classifications that they already have and essentially put out a cloud guidance that makes clear to government agencies what data can be on the public cloud and what data must stay on premise. And typically we see this basic kind of framework of a 3-tier data classification system. It's quite a common one, where you have unclassified data, official data, and then sort of secret and above. And most governments will allow unclassified and official data to be stored on an accredited public cloud provider that meets those security standards that we talked about earlier. And then many governments at this point, although this is starting to change, will require a private cloud or a hybrid cloud solution for that secret and above type data. Data classification does not have to be a hard exercise. I feel like I've seen governments, really struggle over data classification for the public cloud. It really does not have to be an onerous exercise. It really is a case of taking existing data classification systems and making it clear what can and cannot be on the public cloud. A couple of tips with regards to data classification. So really the focus of any data classification system that a government puts out should really be limited to the public sector data. We have seen governments get very twisted up, trying to essentially try to apply a data classification system that applies to the private sector as well. Private sector already will have their own data classification systems. Financial services, entities already do data classification. And so best practice data classification is really limited to that core public sector government data. Another key piece is to sort of avoid overclassification. So we tend to see, governments essentially overclassify various data sets when it's perhaps not required. Overclassifying comes with steep costs because you're essentially spending all the time, resources, and talent in protecting data that does not need to be protected at the level of that classification. Public cloud providers, commercial cloud already provide an extremely high bar of security and privacy controls. And so the idea of, essentially not using public funds as efficiently as possible by trying to protect data that is not that sensitive is something that most governments want to avoid. And the very last thing that I would point out is sometimes we find that the data classification policies themselves are classified. That ends up being really hard for everyone involved because essentially the cloud service provider then becomes unable to work with the customer to really define how to define what data can be on the public cloud, how to classify, and how to apply the best security and privacy controls. So we would recommend that the cloud classification system be made public or at least unclassified or official at some level. The very last concept I'll talk about is this procurement. And again, if you don't get procurement right, the rest of it is just a very nice policy document that doesn't actually have any impact. There are core differences between cloud procurement versus the traditional IT procurement. We would recommend that procurement systems that are really trying to drive digital transformation be focused on performance-based requirements and rapid innovation, that whole Agile concept that we've just spent quite some time today talking about. Pricing, there are core differences there as well. Fundamentally, that the cloud is for on-demand pricing, consumption-based, pay-as-you-go. This is often, not in sync with traditional procurement practices that require fixed prices, fixed catalogs, fixed-term contracts. And so making that sort of mental switch to enable that true scalability of the public cloud is a key part of procurement reform. Another key piece is making sure that terms and conditions actually work for a public cloud provider. The model is fundamentally different than traditional IT procurement. And so having that flexibility to discuss what terms and conditions make sense for the public cloud is really, really important as you establish whole of government agreements with the public cloud providers. And then fundamentally, as we discussed, there's difference in the governance piece. but also this core idea that security is suddenly a shared responsibility between the cloud service provider and the customer. And to make sure that the procurement model recognizes that and recognizes that the customer is responsible for protecting the data in the cloud, while the cloud service provider is responsible for that underlying infrastructure security. Cloud first, as I said at the beginning, is exploding all over the world, especially in a post-COVID environment. We've seen many governments who didn't have cloud first policies and therefore couldn't use cloud to enable that remote work, that distance learning, to make sure that the Ministry of Health websites didn't keep crashing. We've seen in that post-COVID lens just a rapid acceleration of cloud first policies. I want to be clear that the countries on this slide are just an example. There are many, many more countries across APJ, across the world, that have cloud first policies. But the Philippines, the United Kingdom, Singapore, as Gregor talked about with GovTech, and Australia are examples in our region that have really embraced the value of public cloud, have issued a cloud first policy, and fundamentally are using that policy as a driver of digital transformation. Thank you all so much. I'm very happy to share the slides after the session. But again, I'm very happy to come and speak to anyone with regards to getting the policy frameworks right in order to drive that digital transformation. So thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Quint, for an exciting presentation, for setting us up with the best practices and frameworks. I really love this pay-as-you-go model. At this time, I want to invite everybody back into the room because we've got a lot of questions to kind of get through. So if I can, this is coming from Cambodia. This is actually directed to Mayanne. How do you see the future of cloud computing for lesser developed countries in Asia?
I think that the future for cloud computing in Asia is quite bright. I think a lot of people are using cloud computing at the moment, and it's really something which the governments are starting to really see and accelerate because there are use cases that have been shared with the general community. So we're learning from each other, and a lot of that is accelerating really, really quickly, I would say, especially during this COVID-19 period.
That's great. Thanks, Mayanne. Really exciting times for all of Asia, I think. We have also another question. This one's particularly for Gregor. Should agencies focus on continued improvement of legacy systems or re-architect them for the cloud? And when would you know the difference?
That's a classic question, right? So you never start from zero, right? You never really a greenfield, and you have legacy as well. The common wisdom and what we see most frequently is that one big bang to sort of re-architect a legacy system rarely works well. It's a fairly risky move. So what most folks end up doing is they start chiseling away. The keyword there is the so-called strangler pattern. It's like the strangler vine, right, that sort of grows around the tree. So that's what people end up doing. They try to take small pieces out of the legacy. It's not easy, but can be done. And then sort of little by little, basically, if you imagine they chisel away at the old system, shrinking what still resides in the old system, right, and moving some things out of it. Now, the question is, not every system is so easy to sort of chop in half and split up. So what often people do is, take out small pieces of the business logic or more read operations out of the legacy data they can cache, and then maybe leaving transactional things still in. Those are common strategies to start getting on the journey. But as appealing as a big bang sounds, that is really the wise approach.
Wonderful, thank you. There's another question, and this is for all. Security is important to me. Can somebody on the panel talk about how security works in the cloud, and does it need to reside in country?
So I'll take a first one, right? So country and security are very different topics, right? So let's talk about security first, right? So people often come and say, well, is the cloud more secure, right? And the short answer is, yes, it's actually more secure because you ultimately have more controls. Now, part of the honest answer is also it's different, right? You have more controls, you have more tools, so you can make it more secure. And that is my advice to most of the organizations. If you look at the existing security mechanisms that you have on premises or wherever you operate, they are usually translations that you have made from desirable properties, right? Like you have the data classifications, like Quinn said, right? And many things, and then you translated this into processes or certain IT controls. Now, what happened is in that translation, that was shaped by the capabilities you had at the time. So what you don't want to do is just copy and paste those mechanisms and processes into the cloud, because the cloud gives you new capabilities and you'll be ignoring all those, right? So what you want to do is take a step back and say, what is really my objective, or what has my objectives and my guidelines been, and retranslate those into the new capabilities that the cloud gives you, and you will find you have more capabilities now. And I would highlight one capability that is often underutilized, and that is transparency. Traditional IT it is not as transparent as we would like. And a lot of guidelines that were made and processes that were made were based on the assumption that transparency is poor. But of course, poor transparency always gives you poor security, and you're sort of trying to build mechanisms around it that you have like audits twice a year or something, all this clunky stuff, if you're blunt about it, that in the cloud you can do much better. So that would be the thoughts on security. And I would say locality and sovereignty is a very different topic, but I'll let Quinn speak a little bit to that.
Sure, very, very happy to. And this is a topic that, you know, I spent a lot of time talking with government officials about. So, you know, from a security perspective, no, you know, having data onshore does not fundamentally improve security outcomes. And the reason for that really is two things. One is that security and, well, cybersecurity is really a function of the quality and the controls available on the data storage, data center, and cloud infrastructure that's in place. And I can certainly tell you that having, you know, a server under your desk that's connected to the internet, it's vulnerable to the same sort of, you know, internet related threats, internet related actors. And that data is fundamentally more safe if it is stored in an accredited, certified, constantly audited, you know, cloud service provider. And then to Gregor's point, the tools that are available on the public cloud are really just transformative from a security perspective. So the ability to do, you know, DDoS mitigation at scale, the ability to use AI and machine learning tools in order to detect threats, and not just detect them, but automatically remediate them, the ability to have full transparency through logging and monitoring tools, that is transformative for cybersecurity. Now, the other piece of the data localization discussion is usually around this data sovereignty, data ownership. And that's why I hope in my presentation, I tried to emphasize this, that our customers, the governments that use the public cloud, the AWS cloud, they are in full ownership and control of the data that they put on the cloud. And that does not change depending on whether the data is sitting in their country or whether it's, you know, tens of thousands of miles away. That ownership, control, visibility remains the same. And so, you know, if you think about the concept of sovereignty, the ability to have data when you need it, the ownership of the data and the control of data, that all fundamentally remains the same, irrespective of whether the data is onshore or offshore. So from a cybersecurity perspective, there's nothing better you can do than use the public cloud. And then from the ownership piece, governments continue to own and control their data.
Great, thank you so much, Quint. And Gregor, we have a question specifically on Malaysia. Are there any updates on cloud usage in Malaysia, specifically on public cloud?
I wish there was a Malaysian government representative here to answer that question. I think they would be better placed. But I've had the opportunity to travel to Malaysia and meet officials there. A cloud first policy was announced in Malaysia in 2017 under the Najib administration. And I'm aware that the Malaysian government has been working very hard to flesh out the actual policies to support that policy statement. Mampu, which is the IT modernization body in Malaysia, recently came out with public articles talking about its strategy for cloud, and the fact that it will use hybrid and sort of the gov cloud for certain number of data sets, while the rest will be moved to the public cloud as soon as possible. So I think the ball is moving in Malaysia from at least what I can see publicly.
Great, thank you. We have a question here for Mayanne. Is there a cloud divide in Asia, and how can lesser developed countries that lack the capital, the skills, and policy frameworks help close that gap?
Thanks for that question. That's a really, really important question. I think that one that Quint and I are probably working on to try and close that gap for sure, especially with regard to the public service and the government use of cloud computing. I think that for the ACCA, like I shared earlier, one of the core ways, there's no point in us talking all about the benefits of cloud if you don't even have your infrastructure in place. So that's why we have all of these tools like the Cloud Readiness Index and the other related indexes that we have to help governments see, and in the first instance, what the foundational infrastructure is in place that needs to be in place before you actually build out a cloud first strategy, for example. This is not to say that you can't do everything at the same time. I want to encourage governments that even if you don't have the infrastructure in place, you can actually put in the building blocks first, because as you know, as many people know, it actually takes some time for some of the ideas to percolate. So if you don't have the infrastructure for cloud, don't worry about it. Put in the cloud first policy first, and then start looking around for people who can actually contribute to this. How you do the investments, for example, in infrastructure is something which is unique to each and every individual country. I think that there are more, I think that what you do need to do is start talking about it like you're very keen and very eager to do it, so that people who are possibly interested in investing or coming in with a public-private partnership strategy would be saying, okay, well, we can see this in the press. This government is looking like it's interested in building out its cloud. How can we actually partner with you guys to do something? Maybe not on a global whole of government scale at first, but from a proof of concept approach, maybe that could be something that is interesting. So I really feel, start talking about it, start putting it in place. You also have fundamental building blocks of a digital society. So let's not talk about cloud, but we have a few pieces that we know are going to be core. A cybersecurity strategy is going to be core. A personal data privacy protection sort of policy is going to be core. Some sort of standard approach towards making standards for cloud and interoperability, that's also very core. So you do have a couple of pieces in play that are common to a lot of different countries. So I would personally encourage you to be looking at some of these building blocks in the first instance and not thinking like, oh, we're actually having a divide and we can't quite climb up. Don't worry about it. I feel that there are lots of pieces. It's like Lego blocks, you don't have to build the house in the same way as somebody else. You can always build the garden first and then you start building the house. Quinn, I'm not sure if you want to add to this, because I know that you and I have had quite a number of discussions with the various governments around the region, and I feel that just talking about it is actually quite useful.
Yeah, nothing to add other than we see governments of all types, starting to experiment on the cloud. I think that the exciting thing about the cloud is that, the same services that are available to US government or major corporations around the world are available to any government, to any agency that wants them. So we see on our side, very exciting to see, governments all across ASEAN, all across Asia Pacific, at least starting to experiment on the cloud, while also building up the series of policies that are required going forward. So totally agree with Mayanne.
Great, thank you too. This one is for Gregor. Grigor, you talked a little bit about the culture of innovation. Can you talk a little bit more about what are the cultural shifts that are needed for cloud adoption?
Yes, and that's a little bit of a longer discussion, probably. Let me, and yeah, I don't live off selling books, but let me highlight that a lot of the cloud strategy book, and even my Architect Elevator book is about really linking the technical transition with the cultural and the organizational changes. If I was going to highlight one thing, it comes back to the similar point I made about security, and that is when organizations want to adopt new ways of working, right? Like the cloud and agility and all these things. Organizations always think first about the new stuff they need to learn, right? We need to learn the cloud tech and how to have tribes and different things. But actually, the most important part is for people to unlearn the assumption and the habits they have made based on past assumptions. I'll give you a very simple example, right? Like everybody who's been in IT knows the slogans about quick and dirty, right? Or we always say, never touch a running system, right? These are all these things, but it means that deep in people's heads sits the notion that moving more quickly reduces quality, right? That's why it's quick and dirty, not quick and clean, right? Or never touch a running system. People have learned that touching something is risky, that change is risky, and that no change is not risky. So the most important step in my mind is actually to unlearn these things and to show your workforce and your management and your whole organization that these assumptions that you have learned to make over time are no longer true. And if you wish, that way you sort of free up the brain cells to actually then fill it with new way of working. So the unlearning part is probably more important than just learning the new things.
That's great. We're kind of at time, but there's a few more questions and I'm hoping it's okay. If everyone's agreeable, I want to make sure I get addressed. One is on the organizational level. What are the core dynamic capabilities needed for organizations to go through digital transformation? And is Agile the dynamic capability or the mechanism through which organizations can develop dynamic capabilities? So that's going to be the last question. And if there's any more questions, once these slides kind of go out, we'll have our email addresses on it. So please feel free. But I wanted to make sure we get that one last question in.
Yeah, and I'll try to be brief and invite the panelists as well. So for me, in the end, it is really the organization's learning ability that is the key capability. And that is a component of Agile, but no label will do this for you. It is basically, there won't be a proven path or recipe for you for your transformation, right? Because your starting point, your staff, your capabilities, your constraints, many things are gonna be different. So while we can help a lot, and there's a lot of technology and many amazing things we can give you and support you, ultimately you need to plot your own course and walk your own path. And that means, the ability to try things out and course correct. And you could call that Agile, but would really say the learning ability, right? To do something, look at it, see how well it works, make it better, and doing that cycle continuously, that is the key currency you gotta have in order to be able to transform.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our participants. Really hope you enjoyed the session. Again, we'll make the slides as well as the recording available, and we'll make sure we have the email addresses. I'm sorry we didn't get to a few of the questions, but feel free to email us and we'll sure to get back to you. Thank you so much, everyone.